Good evening, everyone. This is Steve Ward with Doc Doubt. Thanks for joining. You can find me on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Search for Doc Doubt Official, all one word. And you can also visit our website at docdoubt.org and email questions or comments anytime, steve at docdoubt.org. I'd be happy to get back with you and correspond. Hope you're doing well. From the goo to you, that is the claim by evolutionary scientists. In other words, in the beginning, the origin of the universe, in the early conditions of the primordial earth, there was this supposed primordial soup, the pond with lightning bolts, with the chemical conditions, the atmospheric conditions that were supposedly appropriate to allow early life to form, including the amino acids, the building blocks of DNA, and the early structures that would become the most primitive cells. But is that really what happened? I'd like to look into that briefly with you tonight, specifically talking about a concept called irreducible complexity. I'll explain a little bit more about what that is. But for now, suffice it to say that the statistical odds against random mutation or the random assembly of biomolecules in this primordial soup is so infinitesimally small as to be zero. But that's somewhat beside the point for tonight. But notice in the culture, there's this claim that science has made God obsolete, that science has actually eliminated God or replaced God. Now, there are some assumptions going on here that are very important to understand. There's the assumption that religion or putting faith in God or believing that God exists is really a way for people to explain away what science has not yet discovered to be true. This is the supposed God of the gaps fallacy, where let's say you're studying, pick anything, and if we don't fully understand how that principle might work or how that process might work in the physical world, the accusation is that religious people will say, well, I don't really understand that, but let's just say God did it. Let's just claim a miracle to fill in the gap in our scientific knowledge. The classic example of that would be the Greek pantheon, the Greek gods, where ancient people didn't fully understand the weather and how the weather worked. So they would invoke the gods or goddesses who controlled the rain, the thunder, fertility of crops, animal fertility, and so forth, as a way to explain what they could not explain yet by science. So the claim is made by atheists that given enough time, given enough scientific explanation, research, development over time, will be able to explain everything in physical terms. So, in other words, atheists are typically synonymous with materialists in the sense, what I mean by that is that an atheist will typically believe that the natural world, the physical world, the matter of the universe is really all there is. And therefore, science is a way that we can understand the physical world around us. And given enough time, given enough research, given enough scientific inquiry, we will eventually understand all that there is to know in physical terms. So science is held in this extremely high regard, whereas religion or faith is downplayed as obsolete, as somewhat of a crutch, where God is just an excuse for what we don't yet know or understand. The important assumption being made here is the claim that science can answer every question, and the answer will have some type of material or physical type of answer or explanation. But in reality, science and faith are entirely compatible. And in fact, it was the Christian worldview that led to science. I'll be able to describe that more another time, but I just want to help you understand that true faith is not blind at all. We don't just invoke God and say, well, this process that I don't understand is a miracle because I just don't understand it. So I'm going to say, well, God must have done it. That's not faith. Faith is following the evidence where it leads. And science, when done well and objectively, will lead you closer to an understanding of God's creation and not just what God did in creation, but we will be able to determine clues as to the why and the purpose for which God created the world the way he did. So, science, when done well, will lead you closer to God because our faith and science are compatible. Consider that science has very distinct limitations. So, for example, studying how the world works, let's take a simple bacterial cell as an example. We can study in molecular biology how the cell operates. We can look under the electron microscope. We can do all kinds of biochemical tests, genetic testing to understand what the processes are taking place within all of that cellular machinery. But that doesn't answer the question why this cell even exists in the first place. And it doesn't answer the question, what is its purpose? So, the why and the purpose, in other words, the direction of life, the purpose and intention of life the way it is, those are questions that science cannot answer. Science can study the physical world to determine mechanisms, to tease out the laws of nature, the structure and function of the world, but can never answer the question why and cannot answer the question of understanding purpose or direction. This is a very, very important limitation of science that we need to understand. Atheists will typically believe that everything that there is material or physical. All explanations are physical. But is that really true? What about other non physical concepts such as love? What about beauty? The beauty of the landscape? What about musical beauty? What about the arts? What about great literature? What about our consciousness? What about morality? All of these things are not physical, but we would all agree that they are nevertheless real. So the claim that all things are physical is just not true. And those things that are not physical or immaterial, just by definition, cannot be studied by science. Science has limitations. Science can get you only so far, but science will point you and give you the clues to what is outside the physical world, outside and distinct from the physical universe. And that's where I want to go a little bit more here tonight. Purpose and direction in creation cannot be understood by science, but that purpose and the direction of life is programmed into life by a designer. The purpose and the why, so to speak, of life requires intelligent input by a designer. But those who are married to the idea, so to speak, that all explanations and all knowledge and everything that there is physical only, will not be able to come to that conclusion. In fact, if you raise the suggestion that there is an immaterial reality, most scientists will not allow those possibilities in their theories. And that greatly impairs and inhibits objective research and coming to the right conclusion. So let's talk a little bit more. I mentioned earlier this concept of irreducible complexity. So, really, what is that? Well, to understand it a little bit more, let me give you an example. So, a great example of this that is often used, you may have heard of this before, is the bacterial flagellum. Notice the incredible complexity of the structure of a simple bacterial flagellum. This illustration here, this cartoon, gives you an idea. And here's another one too, that there are many intricate components to the bacterial flagellum. It's basically a molecular machine where you have joints and bushings and gears, rotors, and so forth in order to propel these simple single celled organisms. So, again, we can study the how, but we can't, with science, understand the why or the purpose. So, really, what does this mean? What is the irreducible complexity? Well, here's the broad concept. If you think of evolutionary theory, this idea that we can have random mutations and by natural selection. In other words, you have random mutations that confer a particular advantage to the cell or the organism that allows it to survive its current conditions better than the predecessor or the alternative that doesn't have the mutation. So, in that sense, there's this theory that we can accumulate these singular mutations by natural selection and develop more and more complex, more and more advanced life to the point where we now have new, completely different and distinct bodily forms. So there's a distinction that's really, really critical. So there's a difference between micro evolution and macro evolution. They're completely different. And let me explain that for a moment. So, microevolution is talking about these random mutations that might give an organism a particular advantage in its current environment to survive, preferentially. Now, in order for those selections to occur, realize that within the organism, within the genetic potential of the organism, you already have these distinct phenotypes or this variance within the population of those organisms. You already have those present. Some will have a survival advantage over others. So they go on to reproduce in the population. Others don't and they die off. So then the result is that the population has whatever the new trait is. That's microevolution. And that makes sense. This is, a simple matter of the survival of the fittest. That doesn't violate the Christian worldview or, matters of faith. But the difference is that once you cross the bridge into a completely different species or a completely different bodily form that is magnificently more complex, you just can't get there with random mutations and this process of natural selection. And here's why. It's because of irreducible complexity. Think about that bacterial flagellum again, the remarkable machinery and the complexity of that simple structure. Well, you can't have random mutations that add on one aspect of that structure and then allow the organism to move and to survive, you have to have all of those components of that molecular machine operating and existing simultaneously, correctly, all at once at the same time in order for that cell to be able to move and to survive in its environment. So, this idea that we can go through this process of natural selection and add on one mutation, get some type of an advantage, and then another, and then all of a sudden you have, this bacteria that can now propel itself. That can't be true because you have to have all of the structures together simultaneously at once. And if you try to reduce that complex machinery down to simpler forms, the whole thing doesn't work. That's why we call this concept irreducible. The complexity of the structure cannot be reduced further because it wouldn't be functional anymore. It's irreducibly complex. It's all or none. So, how could a bacteria, excuse me, develop a flagellum by random mutation and natural selection, just one mutation at a time? That can't be done. The entire structure is needed to be together in order to operate correctly. So, this raises the difference again between the micro and the macro evolution. And what's important to understand is that there is no evidence in the fossil record. We've never observed macro evolution at all. If you hear scientists who are atheists claim that evolution is proven to be true. It's in so many science textbooks today. That is not the case. The broad term evolution has to be understood differently in terms of its two very distinct uh, subtypes, microevolution or macroevolution, and they're very, very different. So let's think a little bit more about the complexity of a simple cell. It's truly remarkable the molecular machinery that is required for life to exist. We have the nucleus, the home of DNA. We have the mitochondrion, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi process. We have reticulosomes, microtubules, and so forth. There's this incredible structure, the molecular machinery of the cell, which is incredibly complex and all must be working simultaneously together, or the cell cannot live, cannot survive. Now, thinking about the DNA itself, the cell membrane is another example, keeping the cytoplasm of the cell intact. The complexity of the lipid bilayer, the pores, the uh, protein and the ion channels that exist within the cell membrane in order to protect the DNA. But for the DNA itself, it's so much more than just a complex, very sophisticated molecule that has, the different amino acid structure to it. The DNA itself is carrying information. It's like a software program, if you will. It's like digital code where the DNA itself is instructing that cellular machinery what proteins to manufacture. There's very complex molecular machinery involved in order to copy and transcribe the DNA, messenger RNA, and so forth, to fold and properly allow for the binding and the geometrical structure of new proteins to form in specific ways in order for those proteins to be biologically active and functional. All of this is remarkably complex. My point to you is simply to say that the DNA is not just a protein or a molecule, it's carrying instructions, it's information rich. And that begs the question, where does this information come from? In other words, why would a molecule that randomly assembled through the laws of physics and the laws and principles of chemistry and biochemistry and chemical bonds and the laws of physics, and how and why would a molecule such as DNA carry instructions or information that implies directionality or purpose to the life? And getting back to what I was saying before, science can answer the how. We can take a look at the molecular machinery. We can study all the different proteins involved, the cell signaling that is involved. We can do those things, but science cannot answer the question why or what is the direction of life, for what purpose. So here is how science has limitations, where we can see the how, but we cannot see the why. In order to answer those questions, we have to engage in more philosophical type of thinking. We call that metaphysics. But understanding that there are realities outside the physical world that are completely valid and true based on the scientific evidence. Even though we cannot specifically measure what is immaterial, we can certainly understand that there are material truths to learn. And that's my point for you tonight. You see, we have a circular problem. Think about the DNA in the simple cell again for a moment. Well, the DNA molecule encodes the proteins that are involved in the transcription, the copying of the genetic information. And all of the molecular structures of the cell are encoded by the DNA. But you can't have the DNA without the cell. You can't have the cell without the DNA. They have to coexist simultaneously in completion together at the same time to be functional. This is similar to the idea of irreducible complexity again, in the sense that random mutation natural selection does not allow cell division, complex processes like copying DNA, transcribing the genetic code. That doesn't allow such complex mechanisms to carry forth and proceed to the next generation. Evolution can never even get started without the complexity of the initial life already being intact simultaneously at the same time. So we have this circular problem that evolution cannot answer. DNA carries information and is language, the language of directionality, the language of purpose. Language and information implies one who is the source of information and the source of purpose, which is mind, which is external to the physical world. And here is where we can get into some of the more theological claims, and we can even use cosmology to help us understand that there was a beginning. It's not controversial that the universe had a beginning. And at that moment, all of space, all of time, and all of matter came into being, which begs the question, who or what created space, time, and matter would have to be separate and distinct from space, time, and matter. So science cannot measure what is outside of the physical universe, But science can get us to the point of beginning where we know from science that there was a beginning to space, time, and matter. And that is where science stops. To understand more, we have to conclude using our own reason that who or what created space, time, and matter must be separate and distinct from it, spaceless, timeless, eternal, matterless, immaterial, or spiritual. And then you look back at the irreducible complexity of the cell and cellular structures with intelligence, giving information and purpose and direction to life, mind. All of these things we can understand are part of the nature of God. And then we can go to the special revelation, which is scripture, for more information. And that unlocks the key to so much more understanding of who God is and who we are. You can get there through science, but science will have limitations. And we have to understand that those limitations are valid and real and are firm boundaries. We can't perform physical experimentation on the original creation event because that was in the past. We can't recreate that in the lab, but we know mathematically and through various theorems that there was a beginning of time itself, and a beginning of space and matter. And we can also see from science that the theory of evolution, at least macroevolution, cannot be true, in part because of the extreme statistical improbability, but also because of what we see in the irreducible complexity of life. All of these things converge together as excellent evidence for the existence of God. And that's worth thinking about a little bit tonight. Remember that it's the intelligence, the information, the language of the DNA code that speaks to mind. Other immaterial concepts, such as morality, begs the question of a moral lawgiver. Beauty, love, the concepts that we innately understand because we're made in the image of God, we can appreciate because God is the creator of the universe, and an appreciation for that is part of who we are. And we can enjoy the beautiful world around us, the arts and literature, music, and so forth, and engage in relationships with one another that are beautiful things. All of those ideas are immaterial. So the atheists claim that all things are physical and are only explainable by science that studies the physical world is simply not true. And that's worth reflecting on a little bit here tonight. So I hope you enjoyed that brief overview. And I don't see any questions in the chat. So let's leave it there for tonight. I look forward to our next time together. Take care.